Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan Hansen.
I'm Jake Friedman.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And today we're going to be doing our Mexica deep dive review, long promised. But before we get into that, we're going to be sharing our favorite Kramer and Kiesling games. So that'll be Brendan and I both sharing our top 5 games by the combination of the two designers. So this is an and, not a Kramer and or Kiesling list. So no El Grande, no Azul. It's got to be both of them.
Yep, you need the peanut butter of Kramer and the jelly of Kiesling, or the chocolate hazelnut spread if you're my toddler. And put those together and you have the perfect sandwich. So Jake, we're going to start with our 5 and go all the way up to our favorite game designed by the pair for the end. And I, looking at my list, something that amazes me is all of these are games that I've played since starting the show with you. I loved Azul prior to starting the show, and I played El Grande. I thought it was awesome, but I never played a Kramer and Kiesling game together. Through Decision Space, we realized these are designers we really enjoy. We did a deep dive on them as a design pair in episode 125. We're clearly going back to this well, covering Mexica today. But yeah, I have some appreciation now that we've spent some time with their ludography to sort of say, what makes these designers special? Why does their name bubble to the top among sort of folks who enjoy classic sort of Euro strategy games? So my number 5 game is The Palaces of Carrara. This is a resource collection game in which you're collecting cubes of different colors to build tiles in these different areas on your board. But it's mostly a timing and resource optimization puzzle. You're trying to grab resources of different types as efficiently as you can. You can only grab them, I believe, in one color. And there's this wheel that goes around. So but you can grab all of them of a color that exists on the board, or on the board in a specific wedge, something to that effect. So there's considerations about when you might grab certain things. You want to be grabbing as many resources as possible, and then when you might build them to certain areas, because you're competing in some ways for these spaces. So it's just a neat sort of streamlined game. They got a new version recently that makes some changes, but I believe you can play the original way that Jake and I have played the most and would recommend with that copy.
Yeah, it's a great game. I love that one. Didn't make my list mainly just because it's not one I've played as recently as some of the others on my list, so it just didn't come to mind for me. But it's probably just off, number 6 or 7. My number 5 game is Pueblo. Pueblo is an incredibly interesting spatial reasoning game that really takes spatial reasoning and hones in on that in an incredibly significant way. In this game, you'll be placing one block on a shared board each turn. The block is essentially 2 rectangles put together, one laying flat, one laying vertical. And then you have to place on the board. You have blocks that are either your colors or neutral colors, and you'll have to place one, then the other over the course of the game. What you're trying to do in Pueblo is make sure that your colored pieces is not showing from the outside the board. So if you're literally looking at the board from eye level, if you can see your colored pieces, then players have the opportunity to make I think it's an eagle that's marching around the board, stop on that space, and you get points, and you're trying to have the fewest points at the end of the game. You also have to be careful about what's showing from the top of the board, as each corner space will do a top-down view of this sort of interesting geometric shape that you're building with the other players of the game. A really unique game, super fun to play. We played it fast and loose, but I imagine for some groups it would be a more plotting and tactical experience.
Nice.
Pueblo.
That's awesome. My number 4 Kramer and Kiesling game of all time is Linko. Linko is this light shedding card game that's perfect for sort of families, where you start with a hand of cards and your goal is to get rid of them as quickly as you can. Linko's quite light, but it's a nice hand management game where the game has a quick pace. You're trying to build, I believe, sets of cards that you're shedding as you go along, and there's a chance to sort of steal cards from other players, like kind of jump on to their turns, from my memory. But Linko's sort of stands in my mind separate from some of the other games of just being a really approachable light card game. Normally Kramer and Kiesling games are sort of these abstract puzzly games, and Linko just is something totally different, and it stands out to me and is a fun little quick playing shedding game.
Can't believe I haven't played Linko yet. I really want to and
Yeah.
need to. My number 4 game is Terra Pyramides. This is a newer game from Kramer and Kiesling, and it's a big box game. I think it came out in 2023. This isn't one I had heard of until Jared of the Laughing Table Friends brought it out to one of our Monday night game nights, and we ended up playing it back to back, kind of exploring the base game and then adding in some of the expansion content that comes in the box as well. This is a tile placement game that really reminds me a lot of games like Babylonia and other Reiner Knizia games, where on your turn you'll just be placing one tile on the board, but then you'll activate tiles, all the tiles in a diagonal line of your choice from that tile that you placed. You're also considering the spatial reasoning of the resources on that tile have to be accessible by your workers along a path from that tile to a pyramid that you'll be working to build up over the course of the game. Hence the namesake, and that's where a lot of your points will come from as well. So another really interesting spatial reasoning shared board puzzle with an element of verticality. Those are all elements that this design duo does better than anyone, and I think it was really fun. I've only played those 2 times. I would love to play it more and check out some of the other expansion kind of modules in the box too. That's Terra Pyramides.
Nice. And that's a newer one. That's 2023 release. Okay, so my number 3 Kramer and Kiesling game is Renature. Renature is another game that we've covered on Decision Space, and it is a domino-driven sort of area control game in which you're using these dominoes to lay pieces out on the board. But the dominoes aren't regular dominoes. They don't have pips. They have animals shown on them. So maybe one side will be a frog and one side will be a squirrel. So you have to connect your domino when you play it by connecting, as dominoes work, a frog to a frog or a squirrel to a squirrel. And when you play, you then have options of playing pieces into the spaces adjacent to wherever you just played that domino. So you're sort of playing a spatial puzzle with laying these dominoes on the board while playing an area majority game with what those dominoes are connecting to. It's mean, it's charming and cute. It also is fairly unique among games like this because there's this really sweet tiebreaker rule that adds this layer of tension to the whole game, which is that when 2 players are tied in a given space, it's as if their pieces aren't there at all. And that completely ensures that the game is fraught with tension up to the very end, where you can make these sweeping plays using this cloud system where you can use these one-time powers that you have throughout the game to massively alter the state of the board right before, say, a scoring period occurs. That's Renature, my number 3 Kramer and Kiesling game ever.
Awesome. Great game. My number 3 game is Savannah Park. This is a family weight game by Kramer and Kiesling that plays in, I don't know, 20 to 30 minutes. It's in that sweet spot where it's a little bit bigger than a game like Linko. It's a full box size game, takes up a lot of space on the table, but the mechanisms are just really light, great for families. Essentially on your turn, when you're the active player, you get to pick one of the tiles on the board depicting various different animals that you would find in a savanna, and every single person has to locate that tile on their randomly seeded board and move it somewhere else, flipping it over, and there it is permanently locked for the rest of the game. So you just do that until all the tiles have been moved and locked in place, and then you're essentially scoring points for clusters of animals. It's as simple as it sounds, but it's a lot more fun than it sounds. And it's one of those classic games where you're like, what? This is so easy. I'm going to do great until everything is a complete disaster on your board and you're have your head in your hands like, what the hell happened? That's
Yeah.
Savannah Park is one. I think it's been re-implemented as Caldera Park as a slightly more complex version, if that sounds too light for you. But I really recommend this original base version of the game. it's more than meets the eye in terms of fun, impactful decisions. Savannah Park.
Awesome. So my number 2 game is actually Mexica, the game we're talking
Hey,
about today. So Mexica is one of the entries in Kramer and Kiesling's Mass trilogy that started with Tikal. And Mexica, I don't want to spoil the episode too much or my mini review, but I guess I am putting this on my list here. And that's just to say I love Mexica. I think it's highly interactive. It's unique in that you're sort of playing an area control game where you are yourselves creating the spaces that you're trying to control, even more so than some of the other Mass Trilogy games. That's sort of a feature, I would say, of the Mass Trilogy in some ways, but it's turned to the knob is turned all the way up in Mexico, where the board is completely empty, and you as the players are literally making spaces on the board by laying out these canals. It's interactive, fun, and sort of distills the Mass Trilogy, I would say, into a quicker playing package that maybe doesn't offer the complexity of some of the other Mass Trilogy games, but I think what's left perfectly matches sort of my taste for a slightly more approachable action point system game where you can really uh, get in each other's way. So that's Mexica.
awesome. Yeah, excited to talk more about it on this episode. My number 2 game is the already mentioned Renature. I absolutely love this one as well. The thing I always say about this is it just feels like a completely timeless game where you have the dominoes, a very old board game component and technology combined with this spatial territory control puzzle, really fighty, really kind of you can't get out of each other's way on the board. That feels of the late 90s, kind of the heyday of Kramer and Kiesling. And then on top of that, you have one more layer, which are these um, really clever kind of resource collection, limited use, special powers that just gives it a little punch that feels like a more modern design twist. And all those things are so disparate yet come together in an incredibly fun and compelling package. Really love this one. I just wish I could play it more than I do.
Yeah. I think that
Renature.
that's a Renature, the design is just so smart because Kramer and Kiesling love to have high agency for their players in terms of what they're doing in the games. And the domino system meaningfully limits that. But then they sort of say, okay, we'll just give you these clouds that give you a ton of agency, and then it will rebalance to what we like to do as designers. I love Renature. That's a good one. We should play it, Jake. My number 1 game of all time, though, is not Renature. It is Cuzco, and number 1 Kramer and Kiesling game. So Cuzco is another Mass Trilogy game. This is the second entry in the Mass Trilogy. If you're not counting Torres, well, we always do that dance, which some people include, but it didn't have a mask on the cover. Cuzco, though, is a tiling area control, area majority game, just like the other Mass Trilogy games. But Cuzco has some twists. One, there's tiles of lots of different shapes that you can be adding to the board that make it feel a little bit more like a shared tile laying game. Not that kind of ticks some of the boxes of something like, say, Cascadia for me, but makes it more competitive, where you're building the play space just like Tikal, just like Mexica, but it's also now has this verticality where you can layer these differently shaped hexagonal tiles on top of each other. You're creating land masses that you can move your meeples on and potentially block each other with, and also lakes that you're trying to surround. Has a neat sort of almost auction-ish system where there's these festivals that come up that are another way that you can score points. It's just this really unique blend of mechanisms and actions that I think has a great arc. It for me, sort of pulls the best of Tikal with its pacing and its arc, and some of the cool things about the flexibility and the agency of Mexica, and packages it alongside a more nuanced, interesting tiling system, and gives you, in my mind, the perfect Kramer and Kiesling game, Cusco.
Awesome. And my number 1 game is the last to name game in the Mask trilogy, Tikal. So you
Nice.
mentioned Mexica and Cusco. Tikal is my favorite. That's the one I'm planting my flag on. I've talked at length about Tikal on this episode, on this podcast at this point. The thing I love about it most is just the delicious, luxurious decision space that the 10 full, rich 10 action points that I get to spend on every single turn gives you. It feels totally unique amongst other games in my collection. It's not one you always want to pull out because, sure, it can lead to some AP prone moments. So if you're somebody that feels like, I don't know, you have difficulty with games that have a lot of AP producing elements, maybe not for you, or maybe if you have a friend that kind of falls into that trap, maybe not for them, but for the right group, I think it's the perfect mix for me of that Kramer and Kiesling action point system of shared kind of tile placement, board building. It's just chef's kiss. That's the one I love the most. And my number one Kramer and Kiesling game, T-Call.
Awesome. Okay. So ends the end of the top 5 Kramer and Kiesling segment, but I think that creates sort of this perfect on-ramp, Jake, into our Mexica deep dive. So it's my second favorite Kramer and Kiesling game of all time, and you are a huge fan of the Mass Trilogy. But we want to start our deep dive the same way we do all of our other deep dives, which is just a little mini review. I've almost given my thoughts, but I do have a review that I'll read out. But do you want to start with yours, Jake? Kind of give us your thoughts on Mexico to ground our listeners as we go into this deep dive and talk about the decision space of Mexico so they can know where you're coming at it, sort of your perspective on it within this conversation.
Absolutely. So I love this series of games, the Max trilogy, of which I also include Torres because it fits right in there. And if I had to rank all of them, I would say Tikal number 1, Torres number 2, Mexica number 3, and Cusco number 4. Though I've played Cusco the least, so I feel like maybe I should just not be ranking that one. But we're here talking about Mexica, and even though it's kind of middle bottom of that list of games, I still think it's a fantastic game. I've had a ton of fun playing. I would give it an 8 out of 10. I really enjoy a lot of the decisions. I do have one bone to kind of pick with this game, and it's that sometimes it feels a little bit too whack-a-mole for me, where you kind of get at a certain point of this game once all the or the vast majority of the different scoring regions have been set up. We've carved our island into different pieces using the rivers. And now on my turn, I'm just only scanning the board and really mathing out where to go to increase my scoring potential there. And then Brendan's going to go and he's going to take it back. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to take it back. I feel like that can sort of become a play pattern in this game. And that happens a little too much for my liking. So that's what bumps it down in that list of other great games in this series.
Cool. So for me, Mexica is a fascinating area control game that gives players a sandbox, a moderate number of tools, clear objectives, and immense amount of freedom to tackle a simple problem. Timing, sequencing, blocking, and spatial decisions really come to the forefront in Mexica. And it's quicker than its Mass Trilogy peers, and it offers a more staid take on the action point system that is a clean distillation of the high agency, low or no randomness thesis of this series of games. Well, not my favorite overall. It's a close second. So for me, Jake, this is a 9 out of 10. I really like Mexico, but I will say your feedback that it can feel a little bit whack-a-mole, I think it's true. And it can feel that way not just with sort of taking control of areas that you've already invested in back, but for me also in terms of trying to somehow as a table control whomever ends up in the lead out of round 1. A lot of the Mass Trilogy games, I think, rely on player-driven balance through interaction to make them fair. So, whether it's T-Call seeing sort of, okay, this person's running away, what can we do to sort of punish their position? You see that in Cusco and Mexico. To a lesser extent, maybe Torres. Torres is just like slightly, I don't know. It's here, but you think it's there too?
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think in my mind, it's sort of part and parcel. And the downside being that play pattern that you can sink into, but Mexico has a lot of fun blocking. That's maybe not, I did include it in my list of mechanisms, but actually I really like how directly you can punish someone in this game for putting themselves in a bad spot. But it's never so punishing as there's always an eject button on movement, which I appreciate in this game as well. You can teleport, which is a nice sort of saving grace of the shared map and movement in this game.
We'll talk about that more, but in some ways that eject is almost like skipping a turn, which can feel
yeah.
brutal.
Yeah. Yeah. 5/6 of a turn, more or less,
Yeah,
to
right.
reposition anywhere. Okay, so before we get into it, though, when we're really going to delve into the decision space, let's talk about the game background. We've kind of touched on it, but this is a 2002 release. So it's the final game in the Mass trilogy or quadrilogy, as we've sort of been calling it, designed by Michael Kiesling and Wolfgang Kramer. So this series starts with Tikal in 1999. Then you have, which wins the Spiel des Jahres. Then you have Torres come out, also released in 1999. In some places. I think that's more of a 2000 release. Then Java is the original name of Cuzco, which came out in the year 2000. And then 2 years later, you get Mexica to kind of cap it all off. And I do think, in some ways, Jake, it feels different than you could take Tikal, Torres, and Cuzco and throw them in a pile and sort of say, this is a thing, and then Mexica is another thing. They're all clearly the same thing, but this is the most different in a way, don't you think?
This definitely feels like the step kid of the Mask trilogy. It's interesting because, yeah, I exactly what you've identified. Those other 3 games share way more DNA than this one, yet this one had a mask on the cover and Torres did not.
Yeah. Yep.
I would go as far as say, if Torres had the mask on the cover, we wouldn't be maybe even calling it a quadrilogy. We'd be like the Mask trilogy and Mexica.
And Mexica. Yeah. Because in part, what are the reasons, right? It's a little faster. It's a sort of shorter game. It's much more spatial. It's a little more abstract. There's fewer mechanisms sort of bolted onto the game. In Tikal, you have the treasure trading. In Cuzco, you have those sort of festivals that I mentioned. There's not the verticality.
It's the only one that has actually 0 randomness after
That's true.
Initial roll, which I think is significant as well.
An initial roll for turn order.
Turn order, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really change anything. Well, I should say, I actually think it's really important, the turn order, but like in terms of how play progresses.
Sure.
You which starting spot you're at is kind of like, why are we're playing this on Board Game Arena, and it's like every time it's like asking me to pick which spot to start at. It's just like, I do not care.
You don't have a side? You don't have a side that you care more about?
I always pick bottom, but it's just, I just have to move my mouse least far.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. We're probably diving too into the weeds already, but I find, there's no way to know this, but I like to be on the top, the bottom, or the right the most. I find the left side, you get trapped.
That's interesting. I would not want to be on the right side.
The right side. Okay, interesting. It's a bigger landmass. Okay, great.
Well, let's put
let's move on.
Put a pin in that one.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Anything else for the game background, or should we dive right into this? We'll do the game overview and then get into the discussion. All right, great.
I think let's dive into it. I'll mention we covered Tikal in episode 177. We covered Torres in a previous episode as well. So if you like this episode and you think this game sounds cool, go back, listen to those past Kramer and Kiesling episodes. You'll learn more about the series.
Awesome. Well, let's now listen to Brendan's pre-recorded rules overview and meet back on the other side for our deep dive discussion.
Mexica is an abstract area control game for 2 to 4 players in which players create areas on an open board while vying for majority in those areas. Mexica is an action point system game. This means players are presented with a menu of options on their turn and a number of points to spend on those options. For example, players can lay canals to create spaces, potentially earning them points, add their temple pieces to existing spaces on the board to increase their claim to an area that's been carved out on the board, move their meeple on the shared board, which impacts where they can claim a space, place bridges allowing players to pass over canals, and more. All of these options cost a certain number of points each turn, and players have 6 points each turn to spend. Mexica is played over 2 scoring periods, each of which have a variable length based on when areas of certain sizes have been created by the players on the board. For example, in round 1, there's a 13 size space to create, 11, and so on. Once these spaces have all been created, and when a player has placed all of their temples during a scoring period, then the round end trigger occurs, at which point each area on the board is scored, and the player with the most points at the end of the game is crowned the victor.
Thanks so much, Brendan. Really
All
appreciate
right.
you taking the time to record that. And without any further ado, 20 some odd minutes into the episode, it's time to deep dive Mexica at long last.
And so, okay, Jake. So, we're going to start by characterizing the decision space, right? The size, the clarity, how perilous is it? And I think that it's tough not to compare Mexica, just go back to the Mass Trilogy over and over again. But I think as much as we can, we should talk about Mexica as a game itself, just as if
Totally.
we were covering any other game on the show. So I will say, based on that Mexica has a very open decision space, right? The action point system itself, you have 6 actions that you can spend on any given turn and a menu of options that you can spend them on. Moving your little meeple around is an action, adding canals is an action, and then you can place your temples on the board, which are allowing you to claim space that it cost actions equal to their value. There's a couple other small things. You could bank actions for a future turn, which is actually something I really love about these games. We'll talk about that decision later. I think how do you manage your actions throughout the game? That's a neat thing that the action point system does, is it gives turns these flex. But overall, size of the decision space, it's almost hard to characterize, Jake, because the action point system in general just gives you options after options after options. There's so many options.
Right.
And then it's a really open space. This is a big decision space. You have a lot you could do.
I think we have to just say it's a large decision space. And that is largely due to an action point system with a menu of actions. I think anytime you have those two elements come together, that is just creates a lot of decisions within any single turn of, which not only which actions I'm going to do, but what order am I going to do them in? And if I put a canal here and then a bridge here, that would allow me to get to this bridge over here to do something. But if I don't do those first two actions, now I'm rethinking everything. So that leads to, I think, just a really big, complex bandwidth testing type of decision space. And then that's coupled with, as you said, essentially crystal clarity. There's no randomness here outside of what your opponents are going to do on their turn. So I think that's why you're have this feeling of it being like hard to quantify it, because we don't encounter that very often in the modern board game hobby. A big decision space and also clear zero sum, no randomness, right? It's like Go or something like that, like that type of decision space.
And to that point, the board itself is a rectangular grid. It's kind of a funky shape that allows for some interesting sort of tiling consideration with the canals. But this game, in its most basic level, is it's almost the dot and boxes game of sort of taking a grid and trying to break that grid into spaces that people are going to claim. It's not quite that, but it's kind of in that shared space, or it's almost as if you went out to a field and said, okay, we're going to parcel out this field into different areas and see who controls them. That's Mexico. It's an open space that you are divvying up, and you are trying to be the one who cuts the most advantageous areas for you into the board while playing a movement puzzle, moving your little meeple around at the same time to control those areas. There's cool features too, Jake. One of the sort of in terms of agency, as we characterize the decision space, it feels really high at the start because this is a waning decision space game. As you add more pieces to the board, there's fewer options of what you could do, right? As you create these spaces, you're both using up the canal pieces that could be there. You're using up your temple pieces from round to round, but you're also creating divisions in the board as you create these spaces that control where you can put your temples. So you face this really interesting decision where when you start the game, you mentioned you all start in the middle of the board. You could place a temple literally in any space on the board on your first turn. You have 6 action points. If you wanted to place 6 1-point temples randomly, more or less, onto the board, you could. And as the game goes on, your flexibility to add these temples into spaces decreases because as a area is cordoned off and created, you can't place temples into them unless your meeple is in them. So you have this interesting sort of dynamic of, okay, I could place temples early and maybe control parcels of the board, but I don't know how much space those temples will be in. So I love that. I think that decision point, the sort of pseudo speculation or really speculation, is this cool dynamic where you have an inflection point, but there's this jockeying period at the beginning of each game where you sort of look at each other and say, okay, I'm going to put this piece here
Yeah.
and see how the board kind of breaks down. It's a dynamic that's awesome for me.
It feels like a real decision point in this game. Like, when am I going to move into a space, taking myself out of the bulk of the board?
Yeah.
And it's also something that really changes game to game. Some games, somebody will go off on the first move, right? They'll teleport to a corner of the board and just start doing whatever they want over there. But in some games, all 4 players, or however many players you're playing with, will just all sit on their starting space for several rounds and just like kind of randomly popcorn their, scoring, or what do we call, like, the power temples?
Yeah.
Yeah, the temples of various values around the board speculatively. I think that's really interesting, and it gets into a question of like what the type of decision space is. I think it's got to be a waning decision
Yeah,
space
for sure.
overall, because you've got limited number of pieces. It's a punctuated waning space, right? Where you've got a certain number of pieces in the first stage, then you'll get pieces back.
Yeah.
In the second age, the number of canals that can go on the board, that's just set, right? When they're gone, they're gone. Same with bridges, though you can move them around. So
Yeah.
it is a waning decision space, but unlike a lot of waning decision space games where it feels like the wane is a very linear progression from a lot to a little, this does have moments where everything changes, right?
Yeah.
That makes it feel a lot more dynamic of a decision space than you typically find a waning decision space game.
And some of those moments, okay, so that's before we get too far into make it explicit. There's 2 ways to score points in this game. If you create areas that match the size of these shared tokens, you're going to score some points, right? So when the game starts, there's a size 13 space that can be created, a size 11, a size 2 size 5s, a size 3, etc. When you build those, you'll get a certain number of points for being the one who completed that space and brought it into being on the board. And then at the end of each scoring period, you also score based on controlling those areas a certain amount. So you have an incentive to be building spaces and an incentive to be controlling spaces. And Jake, those inflection points that you're talking about, the ones that can come up are sort of, okay, when are people racing to start building these areas? Because I want to be the first one to build the big areas. Those are the ones that are worth the most points. But I could place my temples anywhere at the start of the game. So I also kind of want to do that, maybe depending on what other people do. And then also there's these inflection points of one little one that's interesting is if you're playing this sort of passive aggressive, we're going to throw our temples onto the board mini game, banking the extra actions is a resource pool that you probably want to pull from, because then you can have this large burst turn where maybe you accomplish a lot and you provide this moment of you're giving other players more uncertainty about what you could do. So it's harder for them to plan. So that's a good thing to be doing. So one inflection point is when do those run out? That causes the game to go in a certain direction. Then when do the canals run out? That goes in a different direction. When do the spaces, the pieces that show you what you're going to score points from, that's another one. And then also, of course, your temples running out is just built into the game as the round potentially ending and having a scoring period. And when those things happen can really inform the feel of the game, which in some ways can be informed by those very early decisions where if all the players stand in the middle sort of throwing their temples out, you can create a mess on the board that actually is kind of hard to put canals around and gives you this really parceled out board that almost emphasizes your movement efficiency in some ways, I felt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Layered on top of everything that you're like trying to do, that the game tells you should try to score points, you should try to make these regions of a certain size and then be standing in them when they're completed. You should try and win majority in different regions. I think what you're really trying to do is just get in people's way and make people be inefficient as much as possible. I think that's the actual game here. It really feels much more of a game of chicken than it does like I'm creating a path of canals in a creative and novel way that nobody's thought about before. That's fine. Have fun doing that. But I would much rather just spend 1 point to put a temple in a really inconvenient place that messes up what you were trying to do. And now you've wasted precious actions doing nothing. When ultimately that temple I put down there, it's going to do something for me at the end of the game, no
Yeah.
matter no matter how much. Um, Great, you made bridges. I'll just spend my turn to just stand on them.
Right.
So,
Yeah. I also, Jake, on top of that, to your point, this might be the most passive aggressive slash just strictly aggressive
it's the
Kramer and
meanest one
it's the
for
meanest
sure.
game.
Yeah.
Because, and we say that, right? Because given how open it is, players can end up completely blocked, right? Someone teleports to a corner of the board because they want to be the one who creates a size 13 space. Jake, I learned recently actually that you cannot be blocked on the first turn of the game, which is that's an important rule. Um, so,
What do you mean? How does that
so
work?
like in the last time we played this game, Luke or someone teleported to the edge of the board to carve it out into a size 13 was
Uh-huh.
clearly what they were going for. And I was the third person after the first player. Let's say Luke was the first player. We're getting into hypothetical territory, but this really did happen in one of our games. He teleports to the corner. The person next to me goes and puts a temple piece directly next to his meeple. So you can't move through other players' temples, right? So then it comes to me. The area hadn't been finished yet. So I said, oh, okay, great. I'm really going to punish this person and put one on the side of the canal. Bridges can go over canals. So I just put one where if the player who I'm going to block, if they built a bridge, my temple is going to block the other side of the only bridge they could build because they found themselves wedged between the edge of the board, a canal they put down to try to create this big area, a temple someone else put down. I was like, I'm gonna just pop a temple right here and we'll have a first round block. And it was like, no, the rules state that you cannot block someone on the first turn of the game, but you could do that on any subsequent turn. And I think,
I didn't know that
yeah,
rule. That's
yeah.
fascinating.
And I think it's important because you need some incentive to get out and do stuff, to make something of the world, to not just stand in the middle and throw your little pieces out there. And that little rule maybe is enough to just move people towards saying, I'll be the brave one venturing out.
Yeah, I mean, one of my main strategies in this game is to like block somebody in the starting gates.
Yeah, if you can. Oh yeah, like while
Right,
you're
because
standing in the
they wouldn't
middle.
be blocked there. They could always just move back and
Yeah,
like right, but that would be
yeah,
horrible.
yeah,
Yeah. So yeah, I like to put a uh canal canal in front of me
yeah.
so that I have like that outlet where I could like put a bridge and then get out of there if I needed to without teleporting. Which I think I already mentioned. It feels like skip your turn.
Okay, and the reason it feels that way, so teleporting is you have 6 action points in Mexica. T-Call had 10. Kramer and Kiesling quickly realized, okay, 10's a lot. Let's turn that dial down. The rest of them have 6 action points, including
It's
Torres.
all
Right?
downhill from
It's
there.
all downhill from there. So you could take your meeple and put in any open space in the entire board on your turn, but it costs 5 action points. So it's 5/6 of a turn. So it
Yeah.
really does kind of feel like a skip a turn. It does give you a lot of agency. There's times in which the right decision is just teleporting to a different part of the board, but it comes at a grave cost, and
Is
you could
there
be
though?
making a lot more out
I
of it.
I'm skeptical of that claim,
Okay,
honestly.
so Jake,
My like baseline heuristic of this game is never teleport.
I mean, that's the ideal, but
Yeah.
what if
I
by
never teleport. I don't think I've teleported once in like the past 6 games and I've won a bunch of them.
Okay, Mr. Flexer. But what if, just to play up the
I'm
decisions,
just
right?
I'm just putting my evidence out for my case that teleporting is terrible.
I think that there's times in which the openness of the board initially, the power of being able to place your temples anywhere, is potentially so useful that you might take being blocked in if it means placing more pieces out and banking extra actions to have a meaningful turn later. And that flexibility can make up for the fact that you are paying for your movement. I don't think you
That
ever want to teleport twice.
that makes sense, I guess. Yeah, where you're like what I'm doing on this turn is so valuable
Yep.
here that I'm willing to take the risk of somebody blocking me on their turn, and then you have to
Or
teleport. But
then
I
you
don't
have
think you
to.
would preemptively teleport.
No,
That just feels
that would
yeah,
not be
okay.
wise. Yeah.
Yeah.
But also another thing that could play into your decision, right, is something a system we haven't talked about a ton, which is that the canals are not just creating the areas on the board by demarcating this is a landmass, this is water, whatever's inside this landmass and the edge of the board counts as an area, but they are also creating a network that you can move with. So you can add these bridges on top of canals. Whenever you're on a bridge, you can, so long as the canals connect to other canals or the edge of the board, which is water, you can move between the bridges as a sort of pseudo teleport. And I think there's times, Jake, where you might hedge your bets and hope that other people sort of build into this canal system and you'll find a way out efficiently
Yeah.
as well. That isn't quite a teleport,
Or
also,
you can add on to it,
or you
right?
can add
Like
on to it.
I will gladly spend 3 actions so that I can canal somewhere else as opposed to 5 to teleport
Yep.
somewhere.
And those
I
moments, oh, go
Yeah.
for it.
I would say I think the inherent trade-off that the game is trying to tell you is like teleport into a place without bridges, then it'll be harder to claim for somebody else to come and take your space away from you.
Yeah.
Maybe there could be a case right at the very end, but it's like, but then how are you getting out?
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
you don't
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
teleport in, put something out, and then teleport out for 10 actions when somebody else could just drop a bridge there for 1 action and move in for 2 more actions.
Yep. That movement system of the bridges and the canals too, I think meaningfully gives the game this sense of openness when you're just using a meeple moving around a grid, that can feel pretty restrictive pretty fast. I think it needs some sort of release valve to let players get around the map, and linking it to this canal system that's demarcating the areas is really cool. It's a sort
Yeah.
of double duty game design thing that makes the game feel more alive than it would without those two pieces, and also makes it does this cool thing, right? Where at the beginning of the game, you have all this openness and agency where you're placing temples everywhere and you're kind of like freewheeling. Then the board kind of seizes up with canal spaces and other people's temples. And you're like, oh, this is a morass. I'm going to have to trudge through this mess. But then while you're doing that, actually, you've built this canal system that gives you this other way of seeing and moving throughout the board. And I think that that's really cool. This sort of inflection point where the board goes from, okay, we're just kind of like taking these little trips, walking along to, oh my gosh, Jake zipped from here to there all the way across the board. And now he's legged out a space here. And it makes it feel more dynamic in the late game than it otherwise would if you didn't have that system, and gives you the cool openness of these games where the decision space, even if it wanes, feels pretty big because of this teleportation system
Yeah.
or the
Eh,
river movement.
Yeah. On the topic of movement, I just want to give a shout out to Benjamin Ing in our Discord, who shared some thoughts on it that I think he said it better than I could. Or sorry, they said it better than I could, which is the river system gets moving around the map to be fun, which is shockingly difficult in my experience. A lot of the time, moving around on a map creates a sense of impatience, and I know what my next few moves are going to be. The dynamism of a map and blocking, being able to teleport and be even more efficient than teleporting with proper bridge usage makes movement an exciting puzzle to unlock.
Yep.
I think that's said perfectly.
Totally. And it's a puzzle you're solving with and against other players, which is the real thing that sort of takes Mexico and turns it up a notch for me. Jake, there's another mechanism that we didn't talk about in the rules overview at all that I just want to mention because I think it ties to two things about this game that are really cool. And that's, you're creating all these spaces, and the game incentivizes you to create spaces of certain types throughout the game, right? With those little markers that you're trying to place on the board that you score points when you create them, uh, if you're in those spaces. But at the same time, at the end of the game, if there's an area of the board that doesn't have one of those markers, but does have people's temples in it, it's an area. It counts. And if you and your fellow players, other players, have created a big old mess where half of the board can't be filled in, all of a sudden half of the board is an area that's going to score at the end of the game for points roughly equal to all the other spaces combined. Or all the other
It
spaces
could be, yeah, right.
proportionally. Yeah.
Could
And I
be
think that
30 spaces.
yeah. So that's a really cool difference with this game too, is that sometimes the board is really parceled out and you're really fighting for majority over lots of different areas. And sometimes you set up the game in such a way that you've made such a big mess that you're all kind of fighting for control of this really big space in the middle. And some of
Yeah.
the decisions at the very beginning where you're laying out temples are informing the shape of the board in the end. Not totally, but somewhat. And that's why it's fun. And that's just so cool to me, how
Yeah.
different of a shape the board can take based on decisions that seem random, but in the end, like I've never had two boards or two play patterns of Mexica, and we've played it easily more than 10 times each that feel the same.
Yeah, except for what I said before about that kind of like whack-a-mole pattern, which I think does pop up frequently, but it's not the whole game, right? It'd be like once we get to a certain point of the game where things are parceled out, maybe it's like the final like if there's 5 parts of the game, it's like part 4.
Sure. Yeah,
Right.
you always
There
end up
is
with a board that is carved into territories that you at the end are then trying to claim.
Yeah. So that like even though the board will be different, the way you get there is different, you still will find familiar play patterns. At least I felt that way in my plays. I like what you're saying about kind of the different sort of like the negative space, right? It feels like the
Yeah.
game's doing something interesting with negative and positive space of the game. And it's just another one of those moments where the game offers like a dynamic shift that's emergent based on how play has progressed, because you definitely do want to focus on the regions that will score in the first age, because those will score again at the end of the second age. So if you want to have double if you want to have your temples counted twice, which you absolutely definitely positively do,
Yep.
then you need to focus on those. But at a certain point, once you get into the second age, and maybe it's like just before the last couple of the regions have been parceled out, all of a sudden, the thing that nobody cared about at the beginning becomes something of all importance, and it can kind of be erased. Right, it's a moment where maybe you want to be like just ahead of other players and sort of like shifting your focus back to the thing that was negative space before, which has now become like the central competitive arena in the game.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really cool. And it's not clear that that's gonna happen always until
Right.
right before it happens, because players have a lot of agency because it's an action point system game designed in this way with how you lay those canals that really matters. Another cool little I think Kramer and Kiesling, Jake, are really good at little twists, right? So they're not twists within the game that cause a lot of rules overhead or mental baggage for the players, right? But they're little twists that meaningfully enhance the decisions and kind of hide invisible efficiencies that you can have. So an example of that here is I like that the game has two canal types. I talked about how Cuzco, when we were doing our top 5, has all these different tile types that you can add to the board. Mexico kind of says, yeah, that's too much, but here's two. And there's a double, so it covers 2 grid spaces and a single. They both cost a point, an action point to put on the board. You spend the exact same. And I think that that's really interesting, trying to sort of figure out. Usually, I want to just be placing twos, right? I'm doing more if I'm spending 1 point to place 2 water spaces onto the board rather than just one. But there are times when I want to do just one, and there are times where I want to do just one, maybe because it's all I need, and I can deny that option from people in the future, or I can shape the board in a specific way. And I think those decisions are nuanced, and they're the type of thing that give this game a higher skill ceiling than it would have otherwise, with not any more rules, overhead, or baggage. Just you get it, right? Oh, it's a smaller one. Oh, it also costs 1.
It's a very weird design choice to me. To me, it feels a little bit like a rough edge in the game, something that probably emerged after a lot of playtesting and weird things happening if you only have the 2 size block, where it's just realize that the game, it just needs to have some 1 square river spaces. The reason that feels kind of something that maybe emerged later is because there's like 25 of the 2 size ones and like 5 of
Sure.
the 1 size one. They're very limited. I'm honestly not really sure what it does to a decision space. It feels like the vast majority of the time you want to be going for the 2, like you said. Sometimes it's great to have 1 available. Sometimes you need ones and they're gone because it's such a limited thing. But it doesn't come up enough, or at least I haven't identified the play patterns where ones are going to be valuable to a point where I would say like, oh, I should just take a 1 now because it happens to be available to take it away from people later. It's just an odd thing. I trust the designers here that this existing improves the play experience, but I can't tell you, like, I can't sit here and like identify what or why about the game needed to have these different sized river spaces.
So you've never spent a 1 when you could use a 2 to take it out of the shared pool?
I may have done that. I
But it's
think
not something
now
you're
that you say it,
considering
it's
often.
not something I. Yeah,
There's
I
a
think
lot to
I
think
think when
about.
you say that, I think maybe I have done that for that reason. But it doesn't feel like, yes, I'm screwing somebody over, like, because
No,
it might just not come up for somebody else that they would need that. I guess as
totally.
a default, it's better. But then it's like, what if you're the one who's going to need that?
Yep. Yeah, no, totally. Do you so pivoting this conversation next, Jake, I think one thing that we've been talking about as we've played the game is you alluded to it earlier, is player turn order. And that largely the reason why that matters is scoring and game end trigger, which
Yeah,
really can impact how the game looks when you metaphorically take a picture and of the map and see how it's scored.
scoring is much more dynamic in a game like T-Call, right? Where when the uh, volcano comes
Volcano.
out, we're starting scoring from that player. Here, once the end game is trigger or the end of the first age is trigger, play will continue around the table until everybody's had equal turns every time. And I've found in my experience that being later in turn order is just better because in that final round, you will be able to see exactly what the board is like and be able to make a perfect decision about how to efficiently place any temples that you have remaining in your supply and how to use up all your action points and maybe even your extra action points. That'll be a great time to use your extra action points if you've banked any of those previously to make sure that that's going to score you the most possible points. But I think even beyond that, it gives the players later a lot of agency about, like, maybe I don't want to end the round because
Yeah.
it just kind of feels bad if you're at the beginning of play order to end the round knowing everybody around the table is going to have a chance to come and take over all of the territories that you're currently leading in. But if you don't do it, maybe they will not end the round and now you're in a really bad position where, like, you had been ahead in action efficiency, meaning you've placed more of your temples onto the board than other players had to that point, and now everybody's caught up with you and will still get that opportunity to come and take over your spaces. So that's been my experience. What about you?
This is one of those things where I tend to be less bugged by game end triggers or positioning like this. I think there's so many decisions you're making, especially with your action points and all the options that you have, that it doesn't feel as impactful as it could. But I definitely think there's moments where I've been the one who starts the end of the round and then just am like, oh God, I should
Because
not have done that. So I hear you.
it just feels
It's
like
definitely a
you're
rough
damned if you
edge of
do,
the
damned.
game. Yeah.
And I think it's ultimately fine. It's not something that I'm even like knocking the game off for on my
Yeah.
like reviewer rating or enjoyment of the game.
Yeah.
But I do think it's important enough that players at the table should be aware of it, right?
I
Because it's
also
a self-balancing game and players should just know that maybe if I have equal opportunity to do something to annoy the person who's last in turn order and the person who's first in turn order, all things being equal, I'm going to block the person who's last in turn order. And if
yeah.
that happens a couple of times, then all advantage gone.
Yeah. T-Call has that really cool system, Jake, of when the scoring round occurs, you score at the end of each player's turn. And I think I I call that out in part to say, they could have done that in Mexico, but didn't. And I think for me, that just demonstrates that they're trying to make a more streamlined action point system game. It is a simplification of a system that's maybe a little bit better than they had in place. Um, but at the end of the day, I think this game is so skill testing that I don't feel like it meaningfully, detracts from the overall play experience. But you could definitely make mistakes in this game, and that's an area where you can certainly make mistakes. Also, the movement. You can really make mistakes with movement.
Yeah, for sure. I'm surprised a little bit that this is one of your very favorites in the Mask trilogy, just because to me, this feels like almost the one that has the most search in the
Mm,
game. it's true that it's not as AP inducing, and I think there's some really smart decisions for why that's the case. Yes, there's fewer action points. I also think that we haven't talked about them, but the ability to bank extra actions helps a ton because that's always good to do, except for
Yep.
like at the very end of the game. So, if there's action points available, I almost always want to be doing that.
Yeah.
Or at least I'm very happy to do that. Like, okay, great. I see something that's profitable. That's going to take me 5 action points, and I'm very happy to use the last action point just to take an action
Yep.
that I can
And
use later.
and you can do that at most twice on a turn,
Right.
which is good. Helps the
Right.
game out.
So
Yeah, I
that
like
helps.
that
Oh,
system.
sorry. Um, yeah, and so we could touch on that more. I'm interested to hear your thoughts, but the reason I find it so searchy is just because late in the game, like the fact that you can get everywhere on the board means I have to look at the whole board. In
Sure.
T-Call, the way that the game evolves, you typically don't have access to every single
Yeah.
tile in the same way. So I can like hone in on different areas. And there's a lot of the board I can just not really care about. In Mexico, you don't do that. So I find myself, especially in the last 2, 3 rounds of the game, sitting there, and especially because maybe I wouldn't do this as much if we were playing live, but especially playing asynchronously, I feel like I have to sit there and like, okay, I can move one block into here. That's going to give me 3 points by moving me from no points to third place. But if I spend 2 actions, I can come over here and then, use another 2 actions to, oh, okay, well, in that case, those 2 action points for a temple is going to be giving me 7 points. So that's, 3.5 points per action point that I'm spending versus 3 over here. Like there's so much of that if you want to do it. And I
Yeah.
feel like because the game is giving you all the information, that's the kind of thing, like the way my brain works. Like I feel like I have to, and that's not the best feeling.
I feel that way about this game too, but the difference is that I don't always do it.
Yeah.
Like the trick is I just don't care quite as much. And I feel, and it's probably why you've won more than me. But it's not, I just I like playing this game by feel. I feel like the pace and the sort of dynamic flow of the game is interesting enough that I don't know. And I never feel like I'm leaving that many points on the table. Like if a big
Yeah.
area is open, it jumps out at you. And there might be times, where I could have optimized for a point or two that I've missed
Yeah.
out on.
And the game usually isn't coming down to a point or two,
Two. Yeah.
though it certainly can.
Yes. And yeah. Well, okay. Part of the reason I think I like this one so much is because of how dynamic the board play space is, but also it meaningfully does simplify the menu. There's only 3 things you can really do because one of the things is just do more on a future turn. And like you said, you almost always want to do that if it's available to you. There's times that you don't want to. There's times where you just have to get to the board. But really you're just shaping the board, claiming part of the board, or moving on the board. And there's little variable twists there. You might, make it so you could move somewhere on the board, but it's still tied to the movement puzzle. And I think that more streamlined approach just works for me. There's already so much to focus on. I think narrowing things down a little bit helps. I feel like I have a core mission and I can focus on that core mission. Whereas in something like Tikal, sometimes I'm like, should I be doing treasure? Should I be trying to build a temple? Should I move and set up a camp? I don't know what's going to be best, which is fine. I like Tikal.
Yeah,
I
feel it
just don't like
out.
it as
That's
much as you.
there in
Yeah.
that case. That's where I'm like, yeah, this is what I want to feel
And
out.
Jake's like, wait, I
Not
can
like I want to
optimize.
right where there's like totally, but I
Yeah,
do think there's a difference there. Like I'm very happy to like feel that out there where we've got like unknown scoring kind of
sure.
potential because of unknown elements in
Yeah,
the game. But here everything is known, and that's like what makes my brain go like, Jake, you might want to check out over there
yeah,
in the
yeah.
corner because what if if you don't look at every single possible region, you won't know the exact optimal play.
Totally. No, for sure. For sure. What where do you want to go from here, Jake, as we kind of close out the conversation on Mexico?
Yeah, I think before I guess you got your chance. I cut you off a little bit. I want to make sure you got your chance to say your bit about the bonus actions. I I think you did. The only other thought I had on that is just while taking them is often like it feels great It's just, I
Yeah.
love this mechanism because it feels great whenever you take them, but it also feels great when you spend them because
Yeah.
it essentially just gives you the agency to like wait and wait and wait. And then when everything aligns, where it's like, okay, because so much of this is like kind of a passive aggressive game of chicken where you don't want to like give almost like renature, right? Where you don't want to set your opponent up for something, right? Where if I'm spending 3 actions to carve off a section of the board, I want to make sure I'm doing it in a way that doesn't allow my opponent to come in to put down a single tile and then use what the infrastructure I've created to score the same amount of points, carve off just as big a region as me. And I love
Yeah.
how having, so much of the game is like waiting, 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 and then somebody makes a small mistake, or just like by virtue of how the game is unfolded, now you have the opportunity to strike, and now you have the agency because you have the saved up pieces to be able to take full advantage of it. I really love that. That's probably my like favorite decision point in the game is deciding like how and when to use those action points that I've banked up.
Yeah, we've talked, Jake, a lot in this episode about the sort of tension between doing stuff now versus waiting to do things in Mexico. There's incentives on both sides. And I think these tokens that give you the ability to bank your actions accentuates that aspect of the game in a really positive way, gives players agency over it. And then also, like the ever important thing, this is right. This is not a math puzzle. This is a game. And those are different things. It is very close to a math puzzle, but it is a game. And the reason why these make it feel more gamey to me and help the game playing experience is the turns in which you take 9 actions and score 15 points or whatever in one turn just feel awesome, right? And it gives the game. We've talked at times about how this sort of system, the action point system of you get this many points on a turn, you use them to do this menu of things, go, can feel almost static at times because it's sort of, I know I'm going to do this many things and I have these as options. And the banking of actions just creates turns that feel different because you either do way less or you do way more. And doing way less is cool because you feel like, oh, I'm a mastermind who's planning a massive turn in
Totally.
the future. And doing way more feels awesome because you're, look at,
Yeah, doing 9 actions in a single turn is
it's
incredible.
amazing. Yeah. It's almost 2
It's
turns in
almost
a row.
10. What if
It's
we just had
almost,
10 on
yeah.
every single turn?
But it's cool, right? Because then you're,
Totally.
it's almost a double turn or 10 actions on a turn, right? That's so
Mhm.
cool. So it plays with it. That's what I'm talking about earlier, where I mentioned the like even the different canal pieces. It's this little twist that like says like, oh, if you want, you could take a double turn almost. And
Yeah.
but it's not like written in the rules or anything like that. It just kind of happens. And I think that that's really where these games are elevated beyond sort of the sum of their parts.
Well, I think we should move into our closing thoughts on Mexico. This has been a great discussion. And what I want to say here is this doesn't always happen on an episode of Decision Space, but I really feel the more we talk about the game, the more I'm like, that is really neat, huh? Like that is a really clever bit of this game. And I think especially really identifying the ways in which there are discrete uh decision space changes. Kind of like
Yeah.
it's a game that has a really great arc. I think that's something that I am coming to appreciate more and more in games. Right? It's one thing where you've got a game, right, a waning decision space game where awesome, I've got all these resources and it's going to decrease on a linear line until the end. That's one type of arc, but it's not as interesting as what's happening here, where it starts out wide open, but now all of a sudden, I've moved myself in a place where my decision space has shrunk a lot for me because there's like a big opportunity to gain a bunch of points right now. But then the game's going to shift back and open up again. And even though we're heading to the end, right, we're heading to no temples remaining, all the uh, river pieces placed, the way we're getting there feels really dynamic, fun, and variable. So I
Yep.
think that's a really cool part of the game.
Totally. For as I reflect on Mexico, Jake, I think where I want to go is the very beginning of our journey with Mexico. So you and I have mostly been playing this game on Board Game Arena. I own it on the table, but I think a cool thing about Board Game Arena is we got to play it a lot in quick succession. And our first few plays of Mexico, every single play was meaningfully different from the play that preceded it. And the little sort of decision space meta of what you should be doing at different points in the game looked markedly different, to the point that it almost felt like we were playing a different game.
Yeah.
From our first play to maybe say our fifth play. And I feel like where I'm at now, 10, 12 plays in, I don't feel like I've reached the end of that. I think that,
Right.
I've talked about how, this is a streamlined mass action point system game, and they've tried to, really reduce the complexity here and there. But even then, I feel like because of its reduction, I'm at that point that I've talked about in games, Jake, that I really love, where it's a problem just complex enough that you think you can solve it without ever really getting to the point that you can. And I think there's just enough agency that I'm sort of like, the next time I play, I really want to try this. Is there a way I could just build with the canals in the beginning of the game to create some meaningful advantage that all understand based on the sort of topography created by laying those out? Like, could I be approaching this puzzle slightly differently? And I still feel like there's a lot of room for me to understand the nuances of this game between the way that you're claiming spaces, the way that you're moving on the board, and the way that you're building those spaces. That it's a real system, in a way that sometimes games that are more on rails, that have a more reliable, maybe it's an awesome arc, but it plays the same way every time, just don't have. It feels alive, and it feels like something you're creating with everyone you're playing at the table at the same time. And I think for me, that's where Mexica really shines. I feel like when I lose, I deserve to lose. When I won, I deserve to win. And I feel like there's always something a little bit different to try. So that's why, this is my second favorite Kramer and Kiesling game ever.
Awesome. Well, we'll give you the final word. And thanks everyone for listening to the end of this episode. We did want to say, if you made it this far, please check us out on Blue Sky. You can follow us at Decision Space over there. Please join us in the conversation about this game and all the others on Discord. We also have a Patreon page where we have a variety of benefits. That's kind of like a work in progress as we figure out what exactly we're going to be doing moving forward, especially with 2 new hosts joining the podcast. But one thing we will do is send out stickers for our Patreons for 2024. So maybe if you've been lurking over there as a free member for a long time and want to get a really sweet, one-of-a-kind Decision Space sticker and a thank you, if you sign up today or in the next couple of weeks, we won't know who is brand new and who's not, and you'll get a sticker too. And yeah, go ahead.
If you are an existing patron, I encourage you to make sure your address is up to date in Patreon, just so those stickers actually make it to you.
Awesome. And until next time, we should thank Henry for our intro and outro music. Reach out, and we'll see y'all next week.
Bye, y'all.
Bye, y'all.